Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Santa Clara County Finance and Government Operations Committee. We are slated for a 2 o'clock start. It is, in fact, 2 o'clock, so we will call the meeting to order, and we'll ask the clerk to please call the roll and establish the presence of a quorum.
Supervisor Chavez.
Here.
Supervisor Simidian.
Here.
We have a quorum.
We have a quorum. Thank you very much. That takes us to item number 2 on our agenda, which is public comment. Public comment is that portion of our agenda set aside for comment by members of the public on non-agendized items properly within the jurisdiction of this committee. We allow up to 3 minutes for speakers during the public comment period. And we have 2 cards today, one from Mr. Scott Largent and the other from Melissa Willett. So why don't you both make your way towards the microphone. Mr. Largent, you can go first, and then we'll go to Ms. Willett. Thank you. Welcome.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Scott Largent. Good to see everyone. I was down at our courthouse, the family court, looking through records. I'm kind of getting more up to speed how our system works down there and what you can and cannot do. And I am starting to really appreciate the people from the clerk's office that have been very helpful for the cause, so to say. It's not like they're breaking the law, so to say, but they're being very helpful because they want this system to work better. I'm starting to realize that with a lot of county employees, too. The phone calls and emails and the amount of people. I mean, I had a Facebook page that, I didn't use this thing for 3 years, and every day there's 20 or 30 people on there that are kind of dissatisfied about things, and they throw out suggestions and different areas that I might need to look at. And I appreciate that help. I really do. It's been very helpful. I pulled some more information about my family law case. I also found out information about when you have a CP case, it's an actual locked protected case. You can't access it. You need to get the code. It's supposedly to protect the child so other people can't look at your case. What it's really designed to is people that had kids out of wedlock, technically, they could hide that kid off to the side and away. So if they went out and cheated on their wife, some big high-tech executive or some politician, they wanted those cases locked and sealed. So you can't get into them. But when the county goes after that person for child support, that motion pops up right there, and then it lists the woman's name, it lists the child's name, so you're like shocked. So I started pulling all these tech executives, and it's like, wow. It's like, I get bored down there every once in a while waiting to go to the clerk's window. This is fascinating information. It's not like I need a big, bag of things to throw at people, but it is really interesting. I'm trying to figure out more things on a criminal level of pulling old cases, and I'm really wondering why so many of these have been sealed. There's cases that should not have been sealed that are, and I think they're really hiding things from the public, and I don't think that's fair at all. I really do not think it's fair. They've been hassling me. I got this scanning wand, and they said I could use the scanning wand, yet they started hassling me over there. So I bring it over to criminal court, and I notice there's all these people in the file room, and they're sitting there scanning all these case files. And I'm like, why do they get to do that? And you know why they get to do that? They're providing this information to attorneys so they can send out all their literature to represent them after they go through our system. So it's okay for the attorneys to get all this information and send their people in there to use the scanning wand. But myself, Susan, Steve, Victorious, we can't use that equipment. It's the new day and age, and I really think they need to stop preventing the public from seeing all this stuff. It's good dirt, though. So thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Ms. Willett, welcome.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'd first like to wish everyone a happy International Women's Day and say that I hope that we all press for progress, not just today, but every day. My name is Melissa Willett. I'm here today as the chairperson of the Citizens Advisory Commission on Elections for Santa Clara County. At its March 6, 2018 meeting, the Citizens Advisory Commission on Elections agreed to make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to pursue implementation of the Voters' Choice Act in the 2020 presidential election cycle, in addition to implementing as soon as possible much needed voting technology improvements, including voting systems, electronic poll books, and ballot-on-demand printing systems. So this is option A, as presented to this committee at the February 8th meeting by the Registrar of Voters. And the formal recommendation is in process, but we felt it prudent to notify this committee prior to the board hearing this issue at their next meeting. The changes to voting that the Voters' Choice Act will require will involve an unprecedented voter education and outreach. It'll be requiring of collaboration between the county, community organizations, educational institutions, other public agencies, and many, many others. Our commission will also assist with that voter education and outreach in whatever capacity necessary, like nothing you have ever seen before. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for being here. Supervisor Chavez, that takes us to item number 3. This is the portion of the agenda where we approve or revise the consent calendar and make any other changes to the committee's agenda, in addition to the items that have already been identified for the consent calendar, and they are items 16 and 17. In reviewing our calendar today, I thought the following represented candidates for the consent calendar, if that was amenable to you, and obviously if there are any of these items that you think we need to hear today, we'll just keep them on the regular agenda. Item 5, the investment policy report. Item 6, the early payment discount program. Item 9, the internal audit work plan. Item 10, the ISD and ESA options to streamline hiring report. Item 11, the ESA extra help usage report. And item 14, the fiscal year 19 master contract list guidelines and process report. And as many of you who are here know, the fact that we place something on consent doesn't mean it's not an important item. It may just mean that we have a very complete written report and that that's sufficient to our needs today. So I don't think we have cards on any of those individual items. We do not. Let me see, Supervisor Chavez, are all of those agreeable to you? All right, well then, what I'm going to ask from Supervisor Chavez is a motion to approve the consent calendar as submitted with the addition of items 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, and 14, unless I see any hands from the room saying no, 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 staff desperately wants to present on that item. And I'm not seeing any of those hands go up. So, Supervisor Chavez, may I ask for such a motion? Motion by Chavez, second by Simidian. Last call. Then, without objection, the revised consent calendar has been approved, including those items. And again, they are items 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, 14, and I believe that's it. Okay? Thank you very much. And the staff anticipating then that the next item will be item number 4. Appreciate your being here to present. Who would like to begin? Dr. Smith, shall we turn to Ms. Gallegos to lead us through this exercise? Or
Sylvia is going to lead.
all right, Ms. Gallegos. And folks, even though we know you all, if you'd please just introduce yourselves for the record and for anyone who may be watching the streaming video. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Sylvia Gallegos, Deputy County Executive. I have with me to my right Cal Larson, our Employee Excellence Awardee this month. Rob Eastwood, who is our Planning Manager in Planning and Development, and also Rob Courtney, who is our Director of Parks and Recreation. I wanted to spend a moment to reset the table with respect to what is before you. You will recall last month you spent some time on our proposal concerning a county arts and culture program, and I did want to take just a moment to remind everyone what the various components are. And so you'll recall that we are trying to, among other aspects, encourage more arts programming for county clients. We are proposing a temporary exhibition of artwork policy at existing facilities. We also propose creating an online directory of available county public art resources as we build more of that. And I understand we'll have an initiative on March 20th that will significantly grow arts. And then we are promoting, which is fairly typical in other jurisdictions, a 1% for art policy for county capital improvement projects. And then lastly, and this is why the presentation is merged, if you will, is that we are trying to make connections between art and history. And so after we finish our presentation, Mr. Eastwood and Mr. Courtney will present on the local history and the historical resource preservation program. And there is ways to connect art through public, history through public art. And, one of our intents here today is we're hoping to get some level of consensus before we go to the board. And so you'll see in the recommended actions that we are proposing consideration of the temporary exhibition policy and also the 1% for arts policy. And we're going to get to this part next, but also a proposal to conduct a solicitation process for a contractor who can help us grow the TOT pie. So in essence, to remind us all, it seemed based on the last discussion that the one area where there may not be consensus relates to the proposal that we would have a soft cap of $400,000 in TOT that would go to SV Creates, and the balance that we could grow would go more directly to arts programming that serve county clients. So with that, we're going to move to the next
Ms. Gallegos, before you move, just a reminder, of course, and I know you know this, but just for those who don't, that was a cap that was supported by Supervisor Chavez, if I remember correctly. I had asked for a cap that was larger on a do-no-harm basis. I think the number I had was 485 or thereabouts based on an average of number of years. That did not win support from my colleague here. I tossed out 450 as a split the difference, and that still didn't win any support. So where we've left that, just to be clear, as I understand it, Supervisor Chavez, is when we move this to the full board, it's with no recommendation as to that number.
Yes, and that is the way it'll be characterized. But I do think there are other areas where there may be consensus.
Oh, absolutely.
So, yes, so my intent would be to narrow where there's not consensus so it's clear going to the board, which is why we have some of these recommended actions. So last month you spent a great amount of time trying to understand our options to grow TOT revenue. And so in this table we depict some options. So if you look at the left column, it describes possible actions, and you go across the row and you can see the effect. And if you'll indulge me a moment, I want to explain these options. So option A would be to apply the current 8% TOT to short-term rentals. And if you look at the double asterisks, how we develop that estimate is based on a consultant report that was prepared for another jurisdiction. So this is an estimate. We don't know how reliable it is, but it's something to work with. So if you look at the double asterisks, it's assumed 200 short-term rentals in the unincorporated areas, average of 56 nights a year with an average daily rate of $88,000. So if you look at the next column on that row, you can see roughly $79,000. And let me make another note with respect to the next column. So we assume the base was the average of the last 5 years collected. And so you can see that number under the first asterisk of roughly $495,000. So if you add the $495,000 to the roughly $79,000, you get a 16% increase. Option B, increase the TOT from 8% to 10%, which would be the average. That would generate $123,000, representing a 25% increase. Then option C would be increase the TOT from 8% to 10% and also apply that to the short-term rentals. We estimate $220,000, which reflects a 45% increase in the TOT. So if the board were interested in increasing the TOT, we would recommend a couple things. Number one, place it on a ballot where there would be other countywide measures so we can spread the election costs. And I'm going to spend the next moment after this depicting in great detail ballot costs, but I'll get to that in a moment. And then secondly, if you were to place a measure on the ballot, we would propose indexing it. And we've had preliminary discussions with County Council. And the idea would be to index it, for example, to the average of the TOT. So if the average went up, our TOT could go up without actually having to go back to the voters. But council would caution us that it would be important to have a clear methodology for calculating the TOT, and then secondly, that we should have a rate cap. So that's preliminary analysis, and if you were interested in doing so, obviously we'd spend a great deal of effort constructing the measured language so that it would be defensible, if you will. So then, if you look at sort of at a high level, your opportunities to grow the TOT, I mean, it really comes down to these things. A, growing the number of operators. B, to the extent that they increase room rates. And then C, increasing the rate. And lastly, and this is reflected in recommendation C, we are recommending that the Department of Tax and Collections be able to do a solicitation process and hire a vendor that can help us not only understand the best practices for enforcement, but be much more active in trying to collect TOT, because right now, due to resource constraints, it's rather passive. And in addition, an added benefit would be that they would be able to also pursue that relative to the franchise fee for cable operators. So that would be another possible way to grow this pot. So now I'm going to turn to the last slide, and I'm hoping to perform a feat that has not been accomplished in the 168-year history of the county, which is to be able to depict this without anyone's head exploding.
Let me see if I can help you with that chore rather than no. I want to help her with that task. Thank you. No, there is no one hand and on the other hand here. There is, however, the actual incremental or marginal cost of adding something to the ballot, and that is distinct and separate. And thank you for displaying it as such from a apportionment of election costs that is attached to any measure that might be placed on the ballot. And Supervisor Chavez, the reason I kept probing on this was that our board colleagues and our committee have a judgment to make about whether or not the potential election costs are manageable or too great for us to consider an increase in the transient occupancy tax. And I understand, and the registrar of voters has been very clear about the fact that until you actually have a ballot and you know what's on it and you know what the other factors are in play, you can't give a precise number. But I did ask in a follow-up conversation with Ms. Gallegos, could we try and say, look, let's take a for instance and then break out what is the real incremental additional cost and what is it that's just apportioning, quote, our share of what are already fixed costs to us. The point I would make, Ms. Gallegos, in looking at this presentation, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is I understand that as an accounting matter that we have a $449,473 cost as an accounting matter for our apportionment of election costs on this hypothetical ballot measure. In fact, however, the money that supports the registrar of voters is, for the most part, general fund dollars, if I remember correctly. Yes, Mr. Arturia? Yes, Dr. Smith? And so if we are charged $449,473 that we as a county have to pay our own registrar of voters, we've moved the money from one accounting line in the general fund to another accounting line in the general fund without actually affecting the general fund by $449,473. Yes?
Let me respond
Or
to
no?
that. I'll
Now's the head blowing off our bodies part, so, okay.
So let me respond.
Actually, what it boils down to is we're just paying extra work to be done to county employees.
I don't think so. I think that's the $341,750 that's the incremental addition.
Right.
But the $449,473 that is an apportionment of election costs is a cost that is already going to be there whether or not we throw one more thing on the ballot. And we charge ourselves as an accounting or bookkeeping matter that amount of money, but we're paying ourselves. We are taking the money out of one pocket in our general fund blue jeans and putting it into the other pocket in our general fund blue jeans, as I understand the chart. Ms. Gallegos.
Yes, so to elucidate that, there are two sets of fees under the apportionment of election costs. And to your point, there are costs that have already been expended and don't change. So for example, the cost of ROV staff time. The other, just so that everyone is aware, under the estimated base fees, there are other costs that they apportion, including election volunteers, equipment, and polling locations. And to your point, yes, those costs would exist whether that discrete measure is on the ballot or not. In addition, though, there are that second set of fees on your right-hand column called estimated vote by mail fees, and they relate to sorting and postage. And that reflects $109,000 that, you know, arguably would be a cost of the county. But you're absolutely correct. There are costs that wouldn't change adding a new discrete measure to the ballot. So to your question,
Excuse me, Ms. Gallegos, I apologize for interrupting, but aren't the people voting by mail regardless of whether or not we have our item on the ballot?
Yes, they are.
Okay. Sorry. Thanks.
So to get to the specific question you had posed, you can see that bottom line number under incremental costs of adding a measure. So unless you have specific questions, more questions about this.
No, but now I'm going to impose on everybody in the room, including my colleague, my high-level analysis born out of experience, because I feel like I continue to struggle to communicate my point on this. And in a minute, I'm going to say it doesn't really matter anyway. But as a member of the California State Legislature in Sacramento, I was often asked to attend receptions that were held in and around the Capitol by statewide groups. I'll pick one, the California Restaurant Association. And they might have something like 100 people coming, and they get a swanky room, and they doll it all up, and they offer nice hors d'oeuvres. And then when you drop in and they send you a letter saying, well, since we spent $10,000 and there were 100 people there, your pro rata share, your apportionment, to use the word, of costs is $100 because you were the 100th person to walk in the room. To which I say, no, wait a minute. I walked in and I had one shrimp cocktail, the fair market value of which was $2.50. So the most you can attribute to me is, as an incremental cost, is $2.50. And the reason this was important was because I had to file paperwork showing whether or not I had received a benefit. And this was a constant source of aggravation, as you can imagine. But my point is the $341,000 may be the incremental cost here that is extra, that is truly additional, that is truly a marginal cost. But that $449,473 is money the county's registrar of voters is telling us they're going to spend anyway. And I don't think anyone's disagreeing with that, or are they?
No, but it would be charged to other people.
Fair enough, instead of to ourselves. So that's a helpful point, actually. So it would be charged to other people, meaning we would be able to recover some of that cost. And so that part is, in fact, an actual cost to our county. Yes? Great. Okay. Who knew that the shrimp cocktail analogy would actually help elucidate the numbers here? Okay. Supervisor Chavez, I don't have any more questions about that. Ms. Gallegos, did you want to finish your presentation?
I would like to.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for letting me go off on that shrimp cocktail trip. All right?
Sir. So you did ask us the last time to give notice to the operators that generate TOT revenue. So we did. So we issued a letter. We received the list from the finance agency. We sent a letter, and then we also followed up with an email. And we did receive one response from Casa de Fruta that had made the point that the Gilroy TOT rate was 9%. And urging that. And I don't know that you have speakers per se, but we did do that outreach, and I wanted to make sure I underscored that point.
Thank you. Let me look to the clerk and see, do we have any speakers on this item? We do not thus far. Sir, if you would like to speak, there should be a yellow card or form in the back of the room. You have it? Great. If you will simply walk down to the barrier here, our clerk will take it from you and will deliver it to me so that we can consider your comments. Thank you.
Okay, and then also I should probably make a footnote to this chart. They're based on two assumptions, 2018 costs and also a ballot with more than one countywide measure, and I wanted to make sure that I made that information available for the public record. So with that, as I said, we have several recommended actions, and we're available to respond to questions if you like. I don't know if you want to pause here or wait for the historic resource program presentation before you entertain questions.
I think what I'd like to do is separate these out into A and B, just to I think it's different enough that we can do that. I also would like to call Mr. Gene Zanger up to the microphone to speak if he would like for up to 2 minutes, because I believe it is on this portion of the item.
I'll speak quickly.
Thank you, sir.
Tourism promotion works. Supervisor Simidian, Supervisor Chavez, my name is Gene Zanger. I'm a partner at Casa de Fruta, located in southern Santa Clara County. I'm also a commissioner at the Visit California Tourism Commission on the state level. On behalf of Santa Clara County, Casa de Fruta collects about 20% of the total TOT revenue generated through our guest stays at our overnights at the inn and at the RV park. I want to propose that Santa Clara County, in partnership with the TOT generating businesses, use a portion of any future rate increases of the TOT to support tourism promotion in our area. Investing a portion of these new dollars to support the recognized tourism promotion serving organizations in South County, such as the Gilroy Welcome Center, you'll be partnering in an increase in overnight stays and thereby increasing the revenues generated for both the growing arts community and the future of tourism. I understand very clearly that the current funds from TOT are specified to fund the arts, and I support that continued funding. However, since the board is considering an increase in TOT, I think it's important that a portion of the potential new revenue funds generated for tourism be targeted to support the growth of tourism in our market. I would make two specific recommendations. Any increase in the revenue over the amount required to be given to the Silicon Valley Creates organization be shared with the visitor-serving organizations to help promote tourism in the area. By sharing these funds generated by tourism, they will support the marketing campaigns focused on increasing TOT collections in the future. Second, I sense in your discussions that the current rate of 8% is being considered too low and should be increased through a countywide vote. I would submit that since the dollars collected is a percentage of the daily room site and the rate of the dollars increase, can I continue?
We do limit you to 2 minutes. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, what else would you like to tell us? And let's see if we can make that work.
Please don't make the mistake of looking at San Francisco's 14% rate and say that's an appropriate rate for South County. It's not. The marketing area that for most of the businesses that are generating this TOT, I think you need to keep that in focus and make that an appropriate rate. In conclusion, I encourage you to support the arts and tourism businesses that generate the revenue that support the arts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Gallegos, if we're going to stay on A, anything else for the moment? I have a couple of quick questions, if I may, and then I want to turn to Supervisor Chavez. Look in part to County Council as well as to you, Ms. Gallegos, and if County Council says we need to revisit it, that's fine, but I do think it's important. These election costs, which and thank you, Dr. Smith, because the reminder that some portion of them would be subject to, if they're not apportioned to us, they could be apportioned to somebody else who would pick up the tab for some portion of it at least. That's helpful. But the election costs presume a county-wide ballot measure, yes?
Yes, it is predicated on this.
And can someone explain whether or not there's legal authority that requires a county-wide election on a tax that would only be paid in the roughly 10% of the county populated by folks in the unincorporated area? So, for example, if this were, I mean, this is not going to be paid for by people in Palo Alto or Milpitas or Morgan Hill at establishments there. And do those local cities, if they have an increase in their transient occupancy tax, do they go to the vote of the people as well? Or do they just do it by council action?
County council can address that.
Good afternoon, President Simitian. We're happy to provide this information. I think before this proposal goes to the full board, if that's okay with you, we'd like to provide it in an off-agenda confidential format. There is a quirk about this that it's probably better to discuss confidentially.
Okay. Well, I'll just, quirk notwithstanding, I guess the question I would like some guidance on, off agenda or not and confidential or not, is if we pass an ordinance here, it applies only to the unincorporated area. And we're talking about a transient occupancy tax that would apply only to the unincorporated area. So if we need to go to a vote of the people rather than impose it exclusively as a board or just simply as a board, what I would like guidance or clarity on is whether or not we really need to ask the 90% of the voters who are in jurisdictions unaffected by this for sign off on the item. In part because it could affect the outcome of the vote, and in part because it could subject us to legal challenge if we don't do it right, and in part because whatever the cost of the shrimp is, it's going to affect the cost of the ballot measure if we're doing it in 90% of the county that is unincorporated as well as the 10%. Excuse me, that's incorporated as well as the 10%. So, Supervisor Chavez, you okay with an off-agenda confidential on this point?
Ask is, just from a timing perspective, as all of this is being brewed, I think off agenda is fine, but I would also just ask if it's appropriate to agendize it for a closed session, if appropriate, prior to it coming to the board, because one thing I have found on occasion with some of these memoranda is that I benefit a great deal from hearing the questions of my colleagues. So if it's appropriate, put it on the agenda. If it's not appropriate, then don't, and just do the off agenda, but explain why you've made the choice you've made or recommendation you've made.
We'll do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then the other question I had, and this is not meant to be an existential question, this is meant to be a real question, is I noticed we have some language for a board policy on public art, and this is a conversation that we've had previously, so I don't want to have the whole conversation all over again, but in looking at the actual language that requires the 1% for art, it raises the question, what is art? And as I say, I don't mean that as an existential question. I just mean one of the things we talked about, Supervisor Chavez, was that these are funds that could be used for things that are not viewed as add-ons, but that are incorporated into the design or construction of the building. And if we have a policy that says, and by the way, you have to put 1% toward art, knowing what counts towards that 1% is going to quickly become a question that needs a good answer. And I don't have an opinion on either what it is or what it should be. As maybe one of the few times I don't have an opinion. But I do feel strongly, do have the opinion that we better know what it is before we have those arguments. Thoughts about that?
Yes, we have spent a considerable amount of time with council actually on these questions. And if the board approves both policies, the exhibition and also the 1% policy, we would develop administrative guidelines because there are significant, First Amendment related questions that we need to resolve. And so part of that will try and get to the answer of how we're defining art at the county.
Supervisor Chavez, on this point, anything?
I would just add this one or two thoughts to it. One is that a number of our neighboring jurisdictions have wrestled this question down to the ground and or have at least enough of a framework for us to be able to borrow. And the one that I would just recommend, there are two, the City of San Jose, they no longer have their policy, but the other I was just going to recommend is VTA. And VTA in our partnership with BART, where everything had to be an excruciating level of detail about what it is, whatever the it is, that might be a place to go look.
All right. Is this, your comment about the First Amendment implications gives me pause as well, and so I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Mitra. Is this something where we could use a little guidance as well from County Council about this before we take action, Mr. Mitra?
I think that makes sense, and we'll do that as well.
All right. And again, that's likely to be off agenda and confidential.
That's correct.
And for the public, if it's off agenda but not confidential, then it's accessible online through the system we've created. But if it's off agenda and confidential, obviously, it'll come only to the board members.
That's right.
All right. Thank you. Supervisor Chavez, have we exhausted this item, and are we ready to send it on, or do you have other issues? Because you've got a bottle of aspirin. Okay, there you go. Are you ready for a motion on this part, Part 4A?
So I'll take a stab at it, but if you could adjust would be great. And that is, I would forward the recommendation from staff on temporary exhibition of public art with the off-agenda report to be available to us prior to us taking final, or bringing it to the full board. That would be my motion.
All right. And I'm prepared to second that, again, with the request for clarity from staff about the fact that you've teed up for our board, but that it comes with no recommendation as to whether or not this is a $400,000 cap or a 485 or a 450. Just I think I'm looking at 4A, 1, 2, and 3, and am I misreading? If I look at,
We have under 4A, 3 recommendations, the temporary exhibition policy, the 1% for public art policy, and then a recommendation about directing us to proceed with the consultant solicitation.
thank you. So the issue about the other funding issue would be embedded in 4B, the way we've got this structured?
It would be, I am going to endeavor to make this as clear as possible when we go to the board, where there is general consensus, and the one, as far as I can tell, one issue where there may not be consensus, and that'll be embedded in the staff report and also in the depiction of the committee's discussion in that part of the ledge file.
Got it. Thank you. Then I'm happy to second the motion. Supervisor Chavez, are we?
So I just want to make sure I'm saying this in the record properly, because we haven't had the last presentation, but we would be moving forward with 4A, 1, 2, and 3. But on item 3, that would come without a recommendation. It would only come with staff's recommendation as we move it forward. Is that accurate?
I think part of the challenge is that the agenda says
I know there's two
4A,
different
1, 2, and
documents.
3, and
Right.
the enclosure says A, B, and C rather than 1, 2, and 3.
Yes.
So
Right,
the-
I just wanted to make sure.
I think you have I'm going to, this isn't the issue that there's no consensus on. This is the recommendation about doing a solicitation process, so tax and collections department can hire a vendor
Got it,
to
got it.
grow our TOT.
Yeah. The reason, Supervisor Chavez, that I mentioned it on this item is because the discussion about 400 versus 485 is contained in the memo we have on 4A at packet page 7.
Got it.
And, but I think the point that's emerging is, yes, it's in the memo, but it's not really part of the 3 sub-paragraphs in the
It's not,
recommended
it's background, not
action.
recommendation.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Mud, as I say.
Motion by Chavez, second by Semidian, clarification by staff. Without any objection and seeing and hearing none, unanimously approved. I would, however, as a clarification on this, ask that we have reference to the issue that was raised by the speaker today about the potential other uses that have been raised. And I appreciate the fact that you went out and did the outreach we asked you to do with the folks who would pay. That's obviously, we've not made a statement about that, but I would like it incorporated so that colleagues can be thinking about it ahead of time, okay? Good. And then Supervisor, forgive me, it dawns on me, we did, and this is a little, again, not entirely clear just because of the bifurcation. Were you looking for direction from us today on the A, B, and C's of whether we were going to do the increase, the expansion, or both of the above?
It would be frankly helpful to understand if the committee has a view about any of the three options, and if you need to, we can certainly bring that up so you can revisit those.
Yes.
So one of them related to applying the TOT to the short-term vacation rental companies like Airbnb, HomeAway. So that was option A. And then the second option was, is the board interested in a ballot measure to increase the TOT rate from 8 to 10%? And as I indicated in the presentation, we would entertain some indexing language. And the last one would be increase the TOT and also apply that higher rate to the temporary vacation rental companies.
So my request would be that, I mean, I personally would be very comfortable with C. I think.
If you'd like to make a motion to that
So
effect, then we have a motion by Chavez and a second by Simidian, and we will, without objection or additional comment, and seeing and hearing none, we'll forward that to our board as a recommendation from this committee. And this is why I said earlier that while I was trying to make sure I understood the cost implications of the election, I was prepared to move forward regardless, really.
The only thing I would add to this section is the point that was raised earlier about whether or not it's appropriate to have any investment from this pot be contributed to tourism, because I think the point that you raised is putting that in as a discussion point is actually very important. And in addition to that, on the staffing doing the investigation relative to Airbnb, we're also doing some outreach work with small businesses also to get people to sign up for to be part of our registry relative to small businesses. So what I was hoping the staff would do is take all the programming we're doing in that whole outreach, communication, what taxes are, and not divide it up. So for a couple reasons. One, it will lower the cost for the people that we're looking at regulating in the future. And what I'm referring to is the small business outreach that we were going to be doing for the, I'm forgetting what the name of the program is, but to get people to sign up for their business license.
The business license program?
Yes. So just to consider that, I'm not direction, just as we're thinking about more people, I'm just thinking, should they all be doing
Since
one
we're
thing?
handling that, I can assure you there'll be coordination.
Well,
since we
I'm
have
not
both
just
projects. No, but I'm only going to make the point that that's absolutely well taken, because you don't want to
Right.
take discrete, separate items to the same group. That makes no sense. What I am going to say, though, is I'm concerned that I think the track we're operating on business license is much slower than this. So we'll have to think about it, but we absolutely agree with your comments.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, so all that, but I really do want to hear the last item on this, because the item 4B.
Oh, we're absolutely going to hear item 4B.
Oh, good. I just want to make sure you weren't walking away.
Oh, no, oh, no.
I have my eyes on you. No, I'm kidding.
Okay, so.
Thank
all right.
you.
All right, I think we're done with 4A, so let's go to 4B, and let's ask for the staff presentation on this, and I think you can expect that both Supervisor Chavez and I have some opinions to share.
Great. Good afternoon. Rob Eastwood, Planning Manager. Your task last time for us was to, and it's a term I wanted to quote directly, tangibilitize your feedback on this item. So we have attempted to do that. It's a bit of thematically a bit of a different item from 4A. The report that came back to you last month was a referral regarding a broader county historic comprehensive policy and program on historic resources. In considering the item, the FGOC gave staff feedback. We tried to articulate that in the first part of the report. A lot of that discussion centered on a potential grant program was our takeaway, and there was references to the all-inclusive playground grant as a grant to reference. There were references to broadening the type of things the grant would look at with respect to ethnic histories, weaving in women's histories and Native American histories. And there was discussion of a program was to go forward to make sure it was countywide, not just focused on unincorporated areas, and to have it as a one-time grant that the board could come back to later. tangibilizing those feedback into potential steps forward. We looked back at the themes that we presented to you. There were a couple themes of a historic program where we thought the county could move the needle and perhaps have a bigger input on historic resources, programming, and enhancement throughout the county. Those were agriculture, viticulture, ethnic histories, and then also just county history. As you know, the board adopted the Santa Clara Valley Agricultural Plan, and we thought as part of that broader effort that's going forward with the task force, the viticulture, agricultural components will probably weave better with that task force and the agricultural plan. With county history itself, sort of a county programming, county facilities effort would likely focus on how that's programmed and pushed out. And so really if the focus is on a grant program, on funding and standing up and pushing out ethnic histories as a county service provider and giving a voice to those histories, that would be the focus of a potential grant program. Steps forward, if FGOC and the board is interested as a first sort of materialistic effort of a broader policy and program, staff is recommending step one would be to update the county's historic context statement. It's sort of the foundation of what's important to the county with history. Step two would be to provide and prepare some procedures on how that grant program would look. And step three would, of course, would be bring those back to the full board for consideration if the board wanted to go forward with that as part of the FY19 budget. That would just be one component. We know the initial referral looked at a broader policy and statement. If FGOC and the board's interested in broader county programming with county facilities, perhaps more services within planning on surveys, it probably would make sense to, with that, bring back a board policy with a focus just on historic programming to set the table and stage and priorities of what programs should come with historic policies. Last but not least, there's the question of staffing and funding. As you know, there's 3 programs today that focus on history. One is in our department, which is mostly regulatory. The second is a grant program that runs through county parks, and it's really dedicated to funding of projects on parks facilities. And the third is the county archives. As there's more resources needed to run the grant program and county programming, a thought should come back to should there be an office, perhaps of historic policy, or an office that would oversee this. As a separate effort, the FGOC and the board might remember there was a referral on the Office of County Heritage, and I'm not sure if that is going forward. The board might want to consider integrating these 2 efforts into that effort also. So still some discussion points with that. Again, we wanted to present options going forward. Next step would be, based on FGOC's feedback, bring this to the full board and then provide a bit more articulation on next steps.
Thank you. Anything else? Mr. Courtney, you just here as a resource, or you want to chime in? Either way.
Primarily here as a resource. So happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Well, let me thank you all for following up so directly and purposefully on the spontaneous suggestion that I offered at the last meeting as we were talking about these issues about a one-time grant program, because it has put some meat on the bones, and it's entirely fair to impose on me the language that I've imposed on you at prior meetings. It's put some meat on the bones in terms of what that might look like. It also, frankly, gives me an opportunity where I have a different view to share that and say, no, that's not where I want us to head, and I know that can be helpful to staff as well, so that no, don't go down that path if that's where at least the majority of the board are. So what I'd like to do is walk through what I'm thinking and talk about ways in which I see this as being similar to, but also different from the path we went down on all-inclusive playground grant funding. I do see it as a genuinely one-time only thing. Now, that's the way I felt about all-inclusive playgrounds, and all of a sudden we got a second round of funding. So, never say never. But to the extent that staff or colleagues or members of the public, for that matter, are asking, is this a camel's nose under the tent, or what other cliche we could use to start an annual program? No, that's not my intention. And part of the reason, Supervisor Chavez and others, that I thought this had merit is, what I think we saw with our existing grant program, which is, I recall, is run through the Historical Heritage Commission with park funds, is that the annual allocation here at the county level went down in part because there weren't proposals. And one of the reasons there weren't proposals was because we're in the midst of a recession. So not only did we have less money, but so did everybody else. And now that we are, at least for some period of time, out of that recession, I think what we've seen is a resurgence of activity in the historic arena and preservation arena, and people who are saying, we not only have the good ideas, but and we not only have some resources finally, but we've got some pent-up demand essentially that wasn't met during those lean years. So my notion was, a relatively modest amount of funding, by which I mean, $1 million times 5 districts, so $1 million in each district, that would be available for folks to access. Again, going back to the approach we took, Supervisor Chavez, with all-inclusive playground grants, which is requiring at least a dollar-for-dollar match. The goal is not to have a free money program. The goal is, bear with me on this one, to work in partnership to see if we can't make some progress on some of these outstanding historic preservation or historic recognition or historic celebration or historic education efforts that are going to differ from community to community. So that part, I think, is pretty clear. When I look at the packet for 4B, packet page 15, or the first page of the memo from Mr. Gerard, I do think, yes, on item number 1, that we also want to make sure that with respect to a county historic resource policy program that we're talking about, programming for ethnic histories, including Native American and women's histories. And yes, historic programs should not focus solely on projects and programs in the unincorporated area. I think that was captured correctly. And that, in fact, programming should include projects throughout the county, including areas and cities and towns, and opportunities for partnerships with municipalities and nonprofit agencies. And I want to underscore that. And here's where I want to be a little clearer about what I am hoping we're going to find consensus on this committee and the board to do, and we'll see. We have the capital C County of Santa Clara, and then we have the small c, which is all of us in the county. And I do not want, underscore, do not want us to be focused just on the capital C County of Santa Clara and its history, including things that I think are very worthy of recognition, but that may be limited and or not the focus of activity in the 15 cities and towns. So if when I ask people where they're from, they don't usually say from Santa Clara County. Occasionally they do, but they say I'm from San Jose, or I'm from Morgan Hill, or I'm from Milpitas. And, the two aren't mutually exclusive, but if folks are trying to recognize, preserve, celebrate, educate what happened in San Jose or Milpitas or Morgan Hill, I want us to be partnering with them in those efforts. And it could be that it's a neighborhood. One of the things that I've learned over the years, at one point I represented, I think, 300,000 people in San Jose, is that while in the smaller suburban communities, the focus may be on those smaller suburban communities as a place of identity, in San Jose, my experience is that people focus very much on their neighborhoods. They say, I live in, and then talk about the neighborhood where they live. And there's a history and a culture and importance that people attach there. So I just want to be very clear that what I'm proposing or suggesting should be about the whole small c county and different ways people identify important histories and their preservation and protection and education and celebration, not the capital C county. And that means that I am not wanting to limit it to agriculture, for example, or the history. Doesn't mean those can't be included. They can, and in my judgment, they should be. But it just means that, if somebody wants to come to us from Milpitas and say, look, we've got a great history program here that we're ready to go, but we're stuck for dough, and we're prepared to partner with you to move it forward, that this one-time only grant program would consider such a program on equal footing with any and everything else. So that's where I would be. Then the number 3 on this is a grant program for historic projects and programs should focus on funding projects from the point of initiation rather than only serving as a gap funding for projects that are close to shovel ready but need additional funding. And here's one where I would say, and this may surprise you, no, that's not what I intended at any rate. I did make a point of emphasizing that I wanted those kinds of projects to be eligible in contrast to the existing Historic Heritage Commission funding, which really is sort of last dollar in, and in some ways very limiting. But, you know, what I'm talking about is if somebody comes and says, boy, you know, with a boost from the county, we could get our project off the ground with our matching funds, great. If somebody comes and says, gee, this is great because we've got just these last dollars, then if for some reason the Historic Heritage Commission money didn't work for them, I'd say great. If that's a good quality project, fine. If somebody said, look, we're 2/3 of the way through our effort, and we need, you know, we're sort of stuck and we need some more dough, but we're more than prepared to match what you've got, I'd say great again. So that's one where I would say I want to be more open as possible. And then your item number 4 was, yes, that this is a one-time effort that could be extended further through the direction of the board. But again, there's not a secret plan to create an ongoing program here. This is truly a one-time notion in my view. And then now on packet page 16, page 2 of the report, I think I've referenced the fact that where it says could be creation of a grant program to support projects and activities consistent with the county's priorities for historic themes and programming. When I say no to that, what I'm saying is it's not that I want to be inconsistent, it's that I want to be responsive to what local communities tell us is important to them. That's part of partnering with people, is not saying, you know, this is all we're interested in. It's part of it is saying, you know, we want to hear what you're interested in doing, and that's going to look different in Milpitas than it does in Morgan Hill. And again, as long as we think it has merit, both of those, in their very different way, could well be part of the history of this small C county that we're trying to support. And then going down towards the bottom of that page where it talks about a grant program focusing on, again, I don't have a problem, quite the opposite. I think I mentioned Native American communities as an example. Other ethnic communities were mentioned. Certainly women's history in the county was mentioned. But I don't want to limit the grant program to those things. I think we're going to, again, this is one where it's going to be very different, which is why I think an area that I'd like to just ask staff to think about a little bit more is, I think this one's going to be harder to score as between one project and another project, because, you know, while each of the all-inclusive playground grant applications was different, they were all for all-inclusive playgrounds. In this case, you're going to get a program that could be a historic structure. You're going to get a program that could be an upgrade to the History Museum in Los Altos. You could get, an education program. I think you're going to see a range of things. So I think it's not quite going to be the apples to apples kind of comparison that we talked about. And then the next thing I'll say is there was reference on packet page 17 to, well, if we did this, could we then eliminate the program that is currently funded, the Historic Heritage Program funded via the Park Charter, to which I would say the answer is no, no, and no. If anything, that's a program that I hope the budget will pump some life back into after years of being relatively underfunded. And again, understanding why, because A, we were broke, and B, anybody who might have asked for money was broke, so we had a time there where it didn't make sense for it to be there. So I would leave that program in place. I would try a one-time only grant program. And the last thing I'll say is, because it's a one-time only grant program, I would like to say I'm going to ask staff to do it within the existing resources and not create a new office of anything in order to do it. And Supervisor Chavez, for a moment, at least, I'm going to take a break.
So I wanted to thank the staff, and I think we may be coming at this from very different perspectives. So I think I'm going to highlight that this may just be something we want to either work a little more at or just have it go to the board. And let me say that when I brought the recommendations forward, both for the arts and to take a look at our historic programming, I think the point you raised, I don't know if it was item 3 or 4, but about the reasons we weren't able to fund quite what people were asking for, and the lack of resource to this whole area. I think it's just a very important point that you raise, Supervisor Simidian, and one I want to underscore. My own belief has been that part of the reason we had a difficult time getting people to come forward with proposals is that the guidelines that we had are pretty restrictive in terms of where we could spend money, even geographically. So, because I know we have a few locations that are nicely placed, and frankly, we want to preserve them. So whether that's via Montalvo or other kinds of projects that we want to continue to invest in. So initially, when I'd been thinking about this, what I'd been thinking about was, one, what is the county's, what is our role relative to historic preservation? And part of what made me ask that question is, in traveling a few summers ago, I was in a park that on the East Coast, and it was a county park, and it had a number of different monuments that were protected in it as part of the overall park preservation. And when I went to look at whose park it was actually a city park, but the county had done the preservation of some older buildings in it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So the county, and I don't know what their partnerships look like, but it made me think, okay, what is it that we as a county should be doing? The second thing is that we are one of the few regions in the country, I think, that doesn't have an overall one big, massive kind of history museum. We have attempts at history all over the place, but not one museum, so to speak. And to your very important point, I worry about the preservation and archiving of lots of different materials, whether that's music or magazines or any of that. And I think one of the reasons I'm so interested in making sure that we're preserving the more recent and modern history is that part of this, our explosion around diversity and who's contributing and all of that is just, it's so critical. And someday I think people are going to look back and say, how did they live together in relative peace and prosper in such a diverse community? And I want to be able to tell that story. San Jose's history archives are, one, they're primarily San Jose. It's huge, but they're primarily San Jose. And two, all they have is a kind of a protected facility to keep things in, but they're limited on what they'll collect anymore. So I've been thinking, well, could we archive certain materials and then make them available through the county library? Or should we? And then I was thinking a little bit about kind of these bigger preservation projects, because one challenge with preservation, it's really expensive. I mean, if anybody here has ever owned an old house, oh my gosh, honestly, you could sell a kidney and not fix your house up. So I want to think about what you've presented, because I think it's very thoughtful. And I've actually wondered if we do need to figure out a way to both enhance the resources that are available through the current programming you do, how and if we should connect it to the cultural heritage work that's being done. And then finally, should we be raising the amount of money, even if it's not by a lot, over a longer period of time so that we can create enough predictability in our processes that people can plan and figure out what it is that they want to preserve? Sylvia, did you want to say something?
Before staff leans in, let me just say, to help you with the conversation, I don't see, and I'm not sure where my colleague is, and again, I'll mention to everybody, this is proof positive that the Brown Act works, because we never get to talk to each other about these things, because when they're on an agenda, we just can't talk to each other.
You share aspirin, though.
And but I don't see these as two competing things or separate things or different things. I see them as two proposals that might both be complementary and work for it, because candidly, to give it its due, Supervisor Chavez's notion is a much broader, bigger picture notion. And I'm talking about what is sort of a, by the way, while we're at it, I've got a notion about a sort of a one-time, one-off proposition. So I want to sort of, for staff trying to figure out, wait a minute, are we zigging or are we zagging? The answer is yes. We're zigging and zagging. And Supervisor Chavez, as you were talking, I was thinking, and I hadn't thought about this before. I mean, I don't know which side of the line it's on in Sunnyvale, but in my district alone, we've got a computer history museum. Mm-hmm. And then in Sunnyvale, and I can't remember which, whether it's in my district or Supervisor Cortez's district, we've got the Lace Museum. So, you know, you talk about a range of things that people are thinking, you know, this is important to us and we'd like to preserve it. You know, it's, and that's before you get to the sort of more traditional or conventional historic preservation efforts or, you know, history museum, quote unquote, for a particular region or sub-region. So, but I think it's, I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive is what I wanted to say. I think quite the opposite. The word that Supervisor Chavez used, complementary, is consistent with my thinking.
Did I say something inaccurate? Because I said something and you all started to lean in and I thought, what did Joe say that was wrong? No, I'm kidding. What did I say that was incorrect?
If I might, I wanted to just sort of reflect or share some reflections on your comments, Supervisor Chavez, as well as those of Supervisor Simidian, about the Historic Heritage Grant Program and some of the restrictions that I heard you discuss last time and reference here as well, right? So because it's funded out of the Park Charter Fund and out of the capital allocation of the Park Charter Fund, that's what restricts it to public park property and what restricts it to permitted improvements. So you should just keep that in mind as you're thinking about it. You talked about, you know, the impact of the recession as perhaps one of the things. I heard one of the Historic Heritage Commissioners speak to that last time. I think that's absolutely true, right? The cities have to have the resources to sort of stand their projects up in advance of this type of program. And I think that Supervisor Chavez, your comments about the total dollar amount, I think is maybe what you were saying. You know, certainly at $100,000 a year, you can't do much of significance within that. And, you know, one option is to increase the amount, but realize, remembering my presentation yesterday, there's a lot of other competing county park projects that, you know, this money would otherwise go to. So if you wanted to supplement the funding, you know, that would be one option. You might consider increasing it, doing it every other year. So there's kind of a bigger pot of money all available at once. I think that might also be part of what we experienced. You know, this year there was $350,000 available and people were sort of ready to do something and they finally brought some projects. So I think there's just a variety of factors that influence it. Provide this mostly as information for you as you continue to think about what it is you'd like to do.
Yeah, and two other things I wanted to raise. So as we've been thinking about the arts programming in particular, it never occurred to me to have the arts activity come back to the board in the sense that to the county. Like in my mind, if SV Creates is the right partner and we fund them to do the implementation, like that to me is a win-win. I think as it relates to historic preservation, it's a little more challenging because I don't think that even looking at the cities that there's a lot of, not just interest, but a lot of prioritization about historic preservation anyway. And I say that at the city, I felt like I was, you know, a little bit geeking out, like, oh no, we got to put money there. And it just doesn't feel like that's kind of it's very narrow group of people who care about it today, I think, and for what that's worth. So what it made me, so just to ask this question, and I don't know if you all thought about this, but is there a group of people that you think have really considered how to prioritize our historic heritage from a preservation perspective, irrespective of what pot of money that it's coming out of, that you think we should have a broader conversation with? And I want to just give two examples that are very different. Archiving materials, like I was talking about, magazines, music, like in an audio way, you know, kind of like a StoryCorps version of how we make sure that we're protecting what may not still be, frankly, because we didn't invest in it as a region very much, like it's dying in front of us. So how do we protect and preserve at least some of the, and it seems like an inexpensive way to do it. That to me seems like something that should just be a must as a body of work. That, I'm kind of just prioritizing that as it relates to just what I think is inexpensive, and frankly, because I think because we didn't invest for so long, I'm worried that if we don't do some of that kind of audio and digital archiving, that we're going to lose some artifacts forever. So that's why I prioritize that. On the second part, and I just
lean in and say I agree.
Oh, there you go. On the second part, I want to just reflect on the point you raised about how we work with communities in order to energize some investment. Because what I like about, it's what I liked about the all-inclusive playgrounds too, is it creates opportunity for investment, which I think is very important. The big question in my mind is, as a board, and this is a question we have to ask our colleagues, do we think there is value in playing a leadership role in historic preservation countywide? And to your point, whether that's with investments when we feel like we can do it, or whether or not it makes sense for us to take a look at a very tiny percentage, not unlike the 1% on public buildings, but taking a very small percentage of our overall general fund or ending fund balance. I don't mean taking it off the top, because as I think about this, I think about all of the decisions we make, I think about in relationship to foster kids, right? Like I think, okay, if I'm spending money here, I'm not spending it on the poorest kids in our community. But as I think about this, if we took a small percentage of our ending fund balance, that we could at least count on what we think would be a minimum amount every year that would allow you to leverage what we're doing through county parks, that would really allow us to say, yes, we're gonna plan, and this is what we're gonna do. And if we have an increase, where we have a surplus over a certain amount, that we want to do what Supervisor Simitian has said, which is really catalyze investments with our colleagues. So I ask that, it's really more of a question, I think, Greg, for you and for Dr. Smith to consider of what you would recommend to the board. I don't mean to do it today. I'm really not trying to put you on the spot. I really want us to think about this, but I do think that the county, I don't think we play a unique role relative to historic preservation, but the one challenge is that I don't think anybody's doing it. And so then the question is, if no one's doing it, how much are we going to look back on this time and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe no one preserved this, this, and this? That's really the question I want to get answered. And I think Dave has given direction on the historic heritage region, because I think he's got a concern about it too, relative to Alviso and other places, and he's right. Like, that's all stuff the city should be doing, honestly. They're not going to, the city of San Jose, they're not going to, and maybe they can't afford it. So does somebody, and is that us? And then what is it that we feel like, out of all the needs we have, that we really could set aside to create predictability, create opportunities for investment, and frankly preserve things before they're gone.
And if I can just follow up on some of the observations Supervisor Chavez made, I think Supervisor Chavez's comments go to one of the issues I was trying to raise in the State of the County remarks this year, which is we confront these issues or challenges or needs that turn out not to be anybody's job. And so then the question is, are they just not going to get done because they're nobody's job? And when you go talk to people, they tell you, well, first, it's not our job. And sometimes we say that, and we say it totally legitimately because it's not our job. And then we also say, as others do, and by the way, that's too big a task for us to take on in terms of our financial wherewithal. And that's why Supervisor Chavez, and well, I can't speak for Supervisor, but it's why the word catalyze keeps coming up, which is, can we, by our partial participation, and it's why I used the examples that I used again when I did the State of the County, when I turned to Dr. Smith and said, how do you feel about a 117-unit mobile home park? He didn't immediately jump out of his seat and say, hot damn, we should be in the mobile home park business. What he said was, if you want to try and be part of the solution and have other folks who could then be drawn into the mix and, find it, that's good. Same with the RIDE program over in the West Valley. Same with the all-inclusive playgrounds. Now, we didn't say it's our job, because it's not. And we didn't say we should fund it fully, because we can't. And we definitely didn't say, wouldn't the staff love to have this be our responsibility for decades to come? Because we know what the answer to that question is. But we did say, is there a way we could play a role to catalyze some not only funding but activity and responsibility sharing with others? And that's part of what I'm trying to get to. And Supervisor Chavez did a better job than I did, frankly, of trying to sort of bring that conversation to the top.
So I think as a next step, here's what I would be thinking about. I think there would be value in having a conversation, really, Dr. Smith, getting you and Greg to give us feedback at a future point, not today, but if we were going to make investments in a really, and I'm not kidding you, like I'm talking 0.5%, 1/4%, and I'm not even sure I like the idea. I'm really asking if there are two parts to the question. Should we be making, what role should the county play? Should we be making a larger, more consistent investment? And then separate of that, I think to the point that Supervisor Smidian raised, which I think, because I think one does not negate the other, really. Should we make some one-time investments in historic preservation? And I'll just stop there, but I think part of that question, I'd really like to give Greg and Dr. Smith a chance to think about it. And then for you all, I do think that there's a question here about, you know, whose job is it? And then what do we want? If it's not our job, what do we want to prioritize? I don't mean the content as much as I mean the how as much as the what in that instance. But if, you know, so if we played a bigger role, what would it look like? If we just played the small role we're playing now and we enlarged it a little bit, what would that look like?
I think one other thing I'll say before we let staff get a word in edgewise again is I also think that this larger, longer term, broader reaching effort that Supervisor Chavez is describing might be more fully informed if we had some experience with a one-off program of doing some grants, because I think then we'd get a little better sense for who's out there, who's got the interest. Is it really nonprofits rather than cities that we're talking about working with? Or,
Interesting.
I think, you know, $5 million is probably a little bit more than dipping our toe in the water, but it's it's at least a way to, as I say, get a little real experience with, you know, what that kind of engagement might look like or produce. So, to staff.
You should see the looks on your faces.
Yeah.
This is how you look.
Yeah, I think I won't speak to the administrative financial ends of this, but just the themes, I think, you know, really to think about the role. I mean, it's both a crowded market and not a crowded market. There's a lot of cities that have a lot of programs, but there's a lot of gaps. I think our initial research came back to those themes to focus on. Maybe that's the potential for the first one-time effort to focus on perhaps those ethnic or themes.
I want to push back on that again. I'm sorry to keep interrupting. I'm just telling you, as one of the 5 policymakers, that is too limited, and it doesn't reflect or respect what people in individual communities come to us with. And I want to reflect and respect what they come to us with. If they come to us with those, I'm going to say great. But telling them what they should care about is not what partners do. And I promise I won't interrupt again, but feel free.
I clearly heard your direction. So that's just a consideration. If it's everything's open, if there's something historic you'd like to promote and the county would like to promote it, that's one form of getting into the business. If we're interested in these certain things that we'd like to fund, that's another. So it's just taking in what is the focus of FGOC and the board on how the program would roll out.
Yeah, and one other thing I would just say that I think is different about historic preservation is that I think it may not necessarily be a public entity that wants to preserve anything. And so, for example, someone approached us, and I didn't even think about this till just this minute, about wanting to preserve photographs. It's a nonprofit, you know, and then I've had others who aren't even a nonprofit yet who say somebody's got to save this stuff that came from my family that lived in Japantown. And I thought, wow, like, and now there's a museum, so we were able to make that connection, but they didn't even make that connection. They were worried about losing something that they thought was really important to San Jose's history, not even their own. We also got approached to purchase a home. And these are big ticket items that Norm Mineta grew up in, and he's a national leader, and he's going to be in the history books forever. And we didn't, you know, we wouldn't have had. In fact, I think Dr. Smith, you and I had a brief conversation about it. But that's the kind of thing that it's actually an important national investment. So in any case, I from a next steps perspective, I would just like to ask staff to think a little bit about what a long-term investment would look like. I'm interested in thinking a little bit more about Supervisor Smidian about what a short-term investment would look like and how best to really divide that up. So if you'd be okay with this, what I'd like to ask is just this section come back to this committee after staff has had a chance to kind of churn on our discussion.
I think that's absolutely the appropriate direction, which is we'll see you in April.
And you, Dr. Smith and Craig, you're important to that discussion.
And I do think,
We'll be here.
I think, you know, if there, you know, I think there was a lot that surfaced today that gives you food for thought. But I do think trying to figure out, is there a complementary path for what I'm going to describe as the larger vision that Supervisor Chavez has articulated and the sort of narrower one-off that I have described. And we'll ask you to come back with that in mind. So Supervisor Chavez, on item 4B, shall we say, what shall we say here to make some
Ask
progress?
to have it come back in the next month, unless, to give staff a chance just to think this through a little bit. I would say, I know you have a really long process to make sure materials are prepped and all that before the meeting. My request would be that if that is too cumbersome, if it's appropriate with the chair, perhaps just producing slides in advance instead of a whole additional report, if that's faster. More just because I want to give you the agility to respond in real time before we go into the budget process.
Yeah, I agree. I don't, again, I don't want to get into the quagmire that is the administrative process for putting an item on the agenda. But I think, you know, since we'll be visiting this one for the third time in 3 months, saying, you know, here's the latest update, it would be fine, however you want to do that. And in the meantime, I'll work with the county counsel's office. I have some specific thoughts about how I might want to ask that you respond to some of the issues we raised, and I'll put those in writing and share them to the extent that I can. I think I can do that as long as they're Brown acted and public documents that are available to all comers, which we would anticipate. So that may happen as well. Depends a little on the guidance I get. All right. Motion by Chavez to continue to the April meeting.
Thank you.
Second by Simidian. Last call for comments. Hearing and seeing none. Motion is approved. Thank you all very much. Yes, we are just whipping through these. Well, and I'm going to, I actually think that call me an optimist, but I think items 7 and 8 are going to be relatively brief. And actually, Supervisor Chavez, I'm going to tell you why I did not recommend these for consent. But then I'm actually prepared to move forward pretty much expeditiously. Don't have comments or questions really. Ms. Harrison, you and Mr. Minato want to introduce yourself just officially to get your names in the record here and tell the world who you are.
I'm Emily Harrison, the Finance Agency Director.
And I am Alan Minato, the Controller Treasurer for the county.
And without objection, I'm going to ask that we sort of do items 7 and 8 together. I'm not going to ask for a presentation. We have the documents. Supervisor Chavez, I'm going to very bluntly say that I would have put these on consent, but for the fact that these policies regarding meals and travel were at the center, as you will recall, of a controversy regarding your predecessor in District 2 5 years ago. And I just thought we ought to sunshine it and have it right out here. And if anybody wanted to testify, we'd get comments. I don't believe we have cards on the item. So if you're prepared to offer a motion, great. If you want to offer questions or comments, fine. Then I've got a motion on item number 7 to approve the recommended action and forward the item to our full board, I believe, for action. Yes? Okay, great. And I'm going to second that and without objection say approved. And then on item number 8, Supervisor Chavez, here we are again, travel policy. Questions here or a motion? We have a motion to approve the recommended action, which is contained in our published agenda at packet page 68, and again to forward to the full board, I believe, for formal action by our full board. So we have a motion by Chavez and a second by Simidian to that effect. We have no speakers. And that being said, then the item is approved unanimously. Before you step away, let me just say, I thought that the thing that was noteworthy about both these efforts was that you were able to simplify without reducing the rigorous nature or expectation of the policies. And in an organization with 20,000 people, I think the way you get compliance is by making it easy for people to understand what compliance looks like. So the simplification, I think, was really helpful in that regard, and I want to commend you both for what I know was a somewhat painful exercise. Thank you. All right. Have a good day. Then that takes us, after items 7 and 8 having been done, and items 9, 10, and 11, that takes us to item number 12. And let me ask the county executive who's going to report on this item.
Martha Wapinski will take the lead.
All right, Ms. Wapinski, welcome.
Thank you. Martha Wapinski, Deputy County Executive. With me today is Tony Felice, and this is a joint report back with the Manager Auditor Cheryl Soloff as well. In the interest of time, we have some brief comments, unless you'd like us just to take questions.
No, brief comments is to sort of set the table for the conversation, I think is going to be helpful. And I'm also going to make sure, do we have comments on this item? I think we do. Why don't you go ahead and make your comments, and then we'll take the public comments after we've heard your initial report and before we take questions, if that's agreeable, Supervisor Chavez. Great.
All right, so I'm going to kick us off. Then Tony will be talking about the future costs, and at the end, we'll ask Cheryl if she's got something to provide as well. Last September, we brought this report to this committee. There was a request to bring this report back at mid-year for an update. It's a two-part report. One is past budget actions already approved by the board that relate to jail reforms, and the second part is a projection of future possible costs. As I mentioned last time, this is an order of magnitude. It's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to forecast possible upcoming needs for jail reforms. It's always evolving, and I want to make sure you know that the future resource needs may change accordingly. So starting out with what the board has already acted on, the board's approved $184 million in one-time and $78 million in ongoing. There's a comprehensive list attached to the report, but generally the changes include facility upgrades, staffing, IT resources, and programs like diversion. It does cross health and hospital, sheriff's office, and facilities and fleet. Since we reported here last in September, additional budget actions approved by the board increased the one-time and ongoing expenses. So one-time expenses were increased by about $18.9 million. Just really briefly, that includes the sobering center at the Reentry Resource Center, contract services for psychiatric physicians, and some capital projects. The ongoing went up by $3.8 million. That had to do with healthcare services such as optometry and the Reentry Resource Center client service linkage. Tony's going to talk about the future projected costs.
To make two important points before we talk about the numbers, first with data systems such as HealthLink and the jail management system, the hope is to measure results and use that data to help drive the funding decisions. And then second, given the level of funding that the board has made so far, our goal is really to optimize those investments. And so departments are evaluating their existing operations and using data when available to figure out the best use of resources moving forward. The projections we have today include the Sheriff's Office and Department of Corrections, Custody Health Services, and Facilities and Fleet, and it does not include the cost of the new jail nor litigation expenses. So for facility costs, it's estimated to be about $99 to $119 million. About 82% of those are related to remodeling and construction for compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and then the remainder, the 18%, is for a wide variety of other jail improvements. With Custody Health Services, they've estimated approximately $5 to $7 million for additional therapy, clinical and administrative staff to provide both medical and mental health care to inmate patients. In terms of the Sheriff's Office and Department of Correction, they're estimating about $1.5 million, and it includes items such as a climate survey, goal setting with lieutenants and sergeants, procurement of scheduling and equipment tracking software, a contract for gender-informed assessment, also additional body-worn cameras for custody deputies, and inmates tablet services platform. And the Sheriff's Office has also provided a preliminary staffing analysis and is in discussions with the County Executive's Office regarding that request. Once that analysis is finalized, additional information will be provided to the board. So to sum it up, this is an order of magnitude, and looking at the range of possible costs before we have the staffing from the sheriff's office, the range is about $100.4 million to $120.4 million in one-time projected costs and $5.3 to $7.3 million in ongoing costs. And if you take what the board has already provided and add the projected future needs, you're looking at a range of approximately $284 to $304 million in one-time costs and $83 to $85.6 million in ongoing costs. And we wanted to also give Cheryl a chance to chime in.
I don't have much else to add other than to just reiterate the difficulty of trying to estimate future costs when key aspects of those costs remain undetermined.
For example?
Well, as an example, we know that future costs will include, like, as delineated here, 5 to 7 million for custody health staff. Those staff will need someplace to be. What will be the cost of the physical space for those staff? It's very difficult to know where they will be, whether we will need to acquire additional space, how it will we construct it, will it be repurposed from something else? That, at least the last time I checked, was still being determined. In addition, there's a number of legal issues that have yet to be finalized with respect to future operations, and of course, without knowing more about what the sheriff's office will need to fulfill its enhanced obligations, it's very difficult to add further dollars with any degree of certainty.
All right, thank you. We do have one speaker, and I'd like to take the speaker at this time before I start in with other comments or questions. Thank you for fleshing that out a little bit more, Ms. Sullivan. Amanda Clifford, welcome.
I'm reading on behalf of Christine. She had to leave. So,
Thank you.
Her words were, when reviewing the costs associated with the jail, I would like to request that there be some awareness or differentiation regarding any costs that would be mandated spending versus voluntary spending on reform. ADA compliance would be a cost incurred by the county under any circumstances. We would not want the public to be confused about the necessary expenses that would have occurred versus the ones we are implementing to improve conditions or culture inside.
Thank you very much. I understand and appreciate the clarification or the distinction that's being referenced. Supervisor Chavez, that brings it back to you and me. And let me just ask, well, let me say first, it's helpful to have some order of magnitude on the numbers, and that I understand that that's really what we're talking about, to the point that I think all three of our commenters have made. Having that information, sort of the question is, all right, so what? What do we do with it? And I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask is anyone, and Dr. Smith, I'll turn to you or to Ms. Wapinski or to Ms. Soliv or Mr. Felice, is anyone in a position to say these costs do or don't look like the experience in other jails? And again, I understand other jails are in counties that have different populations, I'm assuming, and to some extent different needs. But do we have some sense for whether these are costs that are typically seen in other venues, or whether they're greater than or less than what we would see in another comparable county if such a place existed?
Well, I think the short answer is no. Maybe let me try to explain. The one-time costs that we're talking about are all essentially driven by the condition of the buildings of the jail and the requirements of ADA and the litigation, and they have a lot to do with judgment, so that there are things that we eventually will agree to in the settlement decree that, you know, sane minds could disagree about whether they are necessary or not, but we will make recommendations that, in our judgment, are reasonable. And all of those costs depend upon the condition of the buildings, the layout of the buildings, the use of the buildings, and the age of the buildings. So all of those costs really can't be in any way rationally compared to other jails who have gone through similar systems, because everybody has a different building. In terms of the staffing costs, for custody, as was mentioned, we're still waiting for a staffing plan on that. Once we do get that, we will be able to give you a general idea of the cost per inmate day, which, you know, could be calculated by dividing our personnel costs by the inmate day. But we don't have that yet, and that part, probably we can give you some relatively useful comparison to others. In terms of the healthcare costs, how do I say this in a tactful way? Much of that is being driven by consultation and the litigation. And frankly, some of it is probably a little much. On the other hand, we've tried to stick with a reasonable judgment administratively, so when we come back to the board, we can say, although there could be a strong argument that maybe this particular level of care is not absolutely required, we think it's reasonable and rational. For example, take ophthalmology and optometry. There are debates in the field as to whether every inmate deserves eye checks and glasses paid for by the county, how many days after they're admitted, what kind of, you know, kind of self-participation in the cost do they have to have, all of which are variables that then multiplied by how many people don't have glasses and how many people need them is probably a little bit hard to predict. In terms of the physical plant facilities, going forward, as you know, we're planning on rebuilding the South Tower, and we're planning on roughly 500 new cells. The way that that ultimately gets laid out, which will be a decision made by the board upon recommendation from the staff, will determine in great part the staffing costs, the program costs, the obviously the non-tangible facility costs like eating and, you know, those kinds of things, programmatic related costs. So those are at this point not predictable, because we're going to give you a recommendation, but you will ultimately decide how that plays out and how much space is delivered or dedicated to various services. Then we have the so-called PLO litigation, which is a separate litigation not related specifically to mobility ADA requirements, but related to operational issues. And we are still in the midst of negotiating the details of that, all of which will have significant effects on cost and staffing. As one example, just one out of hundreds, there's an ongoing debate about how many hours per day we're going to commit to have inmates who are in restricted housing out of their cells, and what being out of their cells means. When those definitions occur, then we can predict accurately, relatively accurately, how much that will cost us. But at this point, those definitions are still up in the air. So that was a long answer. I should have stayed with no.
No, thank you. Thank you. It was very comprehensive and very thorough. And, you know, I just, not to be ironic, but, you know, when you said, what does out of your cell mean? You know, back to what is art? I mean, you think there are answers to these questions, and sometimes there are and sometimes there aren't. So
It's
that was
intriguing. You would be very interested. Does out of the cell mean you have to be in program, or can you just be standing outside of your cell, or can you be restrained and restricted outside of your cell? And what if you don't desire to go outside of your cell? Does that count? It's really bizarre sitting through these meetings.
all right. Supervisor Chavez.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to, I don't see anybody here, I don't think there's anybody here from the sheriff's office, but there were two things I wanted to make sure. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm blind. Two things that I wanted to make sure that when we have our study session on the 20th, Melanie, that I want to make sure we are able to respond to. One that's under your purview, and that's getting a contract with whoever our gender responsive person's going to, you know, partner is going to be. And the one thing I'll say is I think you all have been very patient. I suggested we move on from whoever it was that we couldn't get. So I'm going to say it again, if we don't have that person. And honestly, if we're doing something that's so cutting edge that we can't find the person, then my question would be, is it someone we need to actually hire? Like, do we need to bring someone in who can play that leadership role? And then second, Matt, to share with Renee and Tony, actually Supervisor, former Supervisor Smith, the NAMI contract that we voted on in November, I'd like to better understand, you know, the timing on that contract, in part because I think testing the partnership we have with NAMI to do orientation with families is something I'm very interested in us doing as soon as possible. And then lastly, on this overall cost issue, there are three other issues that I just want to make, just to make it all more complicated. One is, in addition to looking at the staffing model relative to whatever we build, I also did a referral asking to look at our staffing model relative to the type of staffing we actually need in the facility, and to make it even more complicated, to take a look at the best way to staff so that we don't necessarily have people spending their entire careers in the jail. You know, what do those career ladders look like that pull people in and out of the jail? And so your point is well taken, that the number of staff, the type of programming, and then the type of skill sets they need, and whether or not for some particular types of jobs, the level of expertise they're going to need will be different than the level of expertise we have today, and that'll have an impact on costs. So I think that, and then I was thinking about bail reform. Like as you were talking, I was thinking about all the different things that we're working on that we hope will impact the volume of usage of the jail. So one point I wanted to make is that reform, even if we're looking at having less people in custody, reform will have a cost. And so that cost could even be, as we look at bail reform, the kind of work we're doing with people external to the facility, because it's part of our jail reform effort to have appropriate placements. So there's also, to me, not a clear, bright line around what is, you know, what are the jail reform costs? Because I think they're really being pushed into the system as a whole, which I think is good policy making, but it also makes it very difficult to say this cost is assigned to that center of activity.
Maybe a couple of responses to that commentary. Number one, in terms of your referral about staffing, at this point we are envisioning, once we get a proposed staffing plan, that the sheriff has given us one. We still need to drill down a little bit to find out why certain numbers, what those work out to be. And once we have something that we think is reasonable, then we can work on the career ladder issue and the mix issue related to programming and transportation and other police officer duties. So we haven't forgotten about that, and we're going to do that. The other thing that I think you said that was really telling is that the more we have been getting involved in responding to the lawsuits and dealing with the problems that we're aware of, the more the question has been raised as to what basic approach do we want to have to inmates, and what basic approach do we want to have to custody and diversion and those kinds of things. The model that was prevalent during the time when the previous jails were built was really, a holding model, and it obviously didn't involve prisoners from the state penitentiary with long sentences, and it was almost all pre-adjudication, so it was sort of a quick in, quick out. But that's not going to be the future, and so the more that we think about how we would want to reform, the more, quote, innovative ideas that various people are coming up with that could end up costing significant money, but actually in the long run saving the community a significant amount. For example, don't quote me on this. Can you turn off the tape? No. One fanciful idea that I had was, as we build the new jail, we might want to think about the possibility of licensing maybe all of it, but maybe just a large portion of it as a forensic psychiatric unit, because out of the 3,000, plus individuals that we have in jail, we know at least 20% of them have significant mental illnesses, and they pose a real significant problem mixing them with the regular jail inmates. Essentially, that would be creating a psychiatric hospital that's got locks on it. I know that sounds scary, don't throw things at me, but we do have to ask ourselves questions like, what do we want to be in there? How are we going to deal with the future? What do we expect out of the population? Population's going to change. We don't have experience with that, but in some ways it'll stay the same. That was probably confusing.
No, it wasn't. Actually, just to follow up on that through the chair, I think, Dr. Smith, one of the points you raised that's been a real critical question that I've been asking myself as we've been going through this entire process is, what is the appropriate placement for the person whose needs we're dealing with? And one thing and there are a lot of things that have been interesting about that. So appropriate placement for some people is diversion.
Sure.
And it's drug rehab. For other people, it's custody. For other people, it could be custody with a high level of psychiatric services because the person's behavior when at their unhealthiest state is so highly criminogenic, right? And the other problem we have is that we have some people that can't safely be placed, and we don't have any place for them. And so it's very, I think, intellectually dishonest as a community to essentially push them back out without being able to have an appropriate level of placement. So the point you raise is one that is really valid and one that we're going to have to wrestle with. The other piece of that is, many, many years ago when I worked at the county, we thought of Elmwood as a very low security environment.
Right.
And the way that Elmwood is structured is built out as if it is a low security environment. That might require some very significant changes to the facility physically, or significant changes to the facility from a staffing and or both over some period of time. And because we can't do everything day one, we really are looking at how we're planning longer term. So I think all the points that you raise are really valid, and I think we're going to have to work with the community to better understand from a community perspective how, or continue to work with them to better understand what the most appropriate level of service restriction or placement is. And then to just be more complicated, you know, the other challenge we're going to have is that we now have a new tool that we're using relative to someone who's committed or alleged acts of domestic violence, and
Right.
whether or not that impacts who we choose to detain, and if we do, under what circumstances. Is that someone who we detain full-time permanently? Is that someone we detain partially so they can go to work? You know, that all of that is still a work in progress. So as I think about the reform work we're doing, I think about I think it's a much longer arc than, and I feel like we're probably still here on it, and we're starting to get here, but we're a long way from the end of it.
Right. Your comment about Elmwood is right on. The new classification system makes Elmwood more filled with more seriously criminal individuals. I won't say, you know, that it has a dramatic effect, but it clearly has an effect, and we know over time it's going to have an effect. So just from a policy perspective, what the staff is hearing from the board, and I just want to reaffirm this, is that we want to have, as they say, the right service in the right place for the right inmate, and have the ability to flex our needs as much as we can, because the future is a little confusing to expect to see. So we want to get as many people who are not dangerous to the community out of the jail, because we do have a lot of individuals who are in the jail who have in there for relatively minor offenses or probation offenses or drug and alcohol offenses that can be managed safely in the community with supervision. So get as many out, keep as many as possible from going in with the same safety concerns. So primary concern is to make sure that the community is safe. Secondary concern, keep as many people out of jail as possible. And once they do get into jail, be able to offer the right services in a safe and effective, efficient way. So that's where we're going. And since James isn't here, I can say this.
Steve, you're going to have to dive on that mic.
As is always true in my experience, good things can happen from litigation. Being sued, you know, really raises our game, makes sure that we pay attention more clearly to things that maybe didn't get paid attention to as well as possible in the past. So even though this has been a long and arduous and painful process, and we, like you say, are just at the beginning, not at the end, I think in the final analysis it is better for the community, better for the inmates.
Right, horrible, but better, yeah. Thank you. And thanks for all your work, all of you. I know we're asking you to, you know, shoot a target that's this big, so thank you.
All right. This item is here for us to receive, and if we can get a motion to receive the report. I don't have additional comments at this point or questions. Thank you for the update. Motion from Supervisor Chavez to receive the report, yes?
So moved.
Motion by Chavez, second by Simitian, without objection, unanimously approved. Thank you all very much. All right, that takes us to item number 13.
Good afternoon, committee members, board members. My name is Maria Love, Director for the Office of Immigrant Relations. And to my left here, we have Nicole, who I will let her introduce herself, but she has been working very closely with our office on some of these projects, as well as some of my office staff. So I wanted to allow them with an opportunity to introduce themselves, so go ahead.
Milena Jovanovic, Office of Immigrant Relations. Hello, Teresa Castellanos. Nicole Farku.
This afternoon, I had prepared for you a very short overview in some of the areas within the report. However, due to the interest of time, I wanted to determine whether or not you wanted us to provide you with the summary or whether or not you just want to jump directly into questions that you may have.
Supervisor Chavez? I've got just a couple of comments as well, and I mean, thank you. We've got the document. We've had a chance to look at the document, so I want to assure you of that. I would just offer a couple of comments. The first is, I think just say thank you. I think we've asked you to be in a lot of places on short notice under challenging circumstances over the course of the last year plus in particular. And I think the organization's been pretty nimble about responding. I think that's tough for a large organization to do, and so not only to you and your office specifically, but to the county executive, I want to communicate that. I would just like to make a relatively small suggestion, not for any formal action growing out of today's meeting, but there's some, I think good and interesting language around packet pages 226 and 227 about how we fit in the county and who we serve and guiding structures and visions. But I want to suggest that when you revisit this kind of language in the future, you might want to give a little thought to articulating why we think it's important to do this work. I think in this organization, the commitment to the immigrants who are part of our county is just a given. And so we sometimes don't articulate for the larger community why this is important. And I don't think we need to, I tried to make the case in the state of the county. I actually think it's in our economic interest to be a place that is welcoming of immigrants. That's certainly not the only reason. I also think it has to do with our values. I think it has to do with creating a safer community if everyone feels truly included and therefore feels that they could say something if they see something. There are all these conversations that I think we internalize because to us they seem obvious by virtue of the work we do and the work particularly that you and your office do. But I do think perhaps laying them out for folks, not just in a report like this, but in the interactions with the larger community will be helpful and important going forward so that people understand why this is important. As I say, I think we sometimes just assume that everyone's on the same page or having the same thought, and my experience is that that's not necessarily the case. Okay, that'd be it. Supervisor Chavez?
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank you very much for the report. This is great to see just the amount of work you've been doing. And I had just a couple of questions that I wanted to better understand. And that is, I recognize that we created an Office of Immigrant Relations, and we, in an odd way, we sort of overlaid it on a structure or not structure, but a network of immigrant organizations that were already doing their own thing, and then we popped on the scene. And I know that in some ways people feel like some of that work's been good and some of it's been enormously annoying because, one, there's a lot more work to go around, and two, we are asking people to do something that they had not done before, which is we wrote contracts, we kind of gave people feedback on those contracts, and then they gave us feedback on how they did. And the idea of us having oversight and really a higher level of accountability, I think, has created a lot of tension, not just between you and the immigrant rights groups, but I would say with me and some of my colleagues in the immigrant rights groups, and frankly, even then with you, because we're saying, look, we're spending a lot of public dollars on an area that we feel very good about doing, but we think that also requires a much higher level of accountability than I think our nonprofit partners are used to, and frankly, no one wants it. And but I think we have an obligation to, especially when we're doing new things, to really determine whether or not the investments we're making are the appropriate ones. That sound accurate, or do you think, no, it's all been a picnic, it's good?
No, that is most certainly accurate, and I think, one of the elements that we try to incorporate is really to try to work directly with those organizations to have them help us. What are the better ways to sort of measure and determine what the impact is of the work that they are doing? So that is sort of one of the new areas that we are bringing onto as we sort of bring each of those groups together to have those types of conversations, to have them be more involved in the process so that they want better understand why it is that we are asking for that information, but at the same time for them to also see, the value, not that they don't know that value, but so they can better help tell us, this is the information that we can provide you, and this is the information that we think would be helpful for what it is that you're looking for.
So I will tell you that I think that is a hopeful view. And I don't think it's a bad view, but I think it's hopeful. And here's what I mean by that. I think that the last couple of big investments we've made in direct partnership with them. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from them. I think and a lot of input. In fact, these agreements were structured in some part based on what people told us we needed to get done. I'm gonna share kind of a different perspective and make a recommendation that I want you all to think about. You don't even need to answer this today. It's just really something I genuinely want your feedback on. I think that if the county is going to be in the partnership business, as Mr. Simidian has so elegantly said in his State of the County, then that partnership will require us, particularly when we're making large investments, requires us to be able to be very accountable. So what I think that means is that when we invest in a certain set of outcomes, that I think it's okay I think three things are okay. I think it's okay for people to say, you know what, I don't want to sign up for that one. And I think we've got to be okay with saying to folks, we get it, no harm, no foul. If you don't sign up for this contract, it doesn't mean we won't engage you on these others. So that's kind of number one. Number two, I think where people do engage with us, particularly where we are investing much more money in the areas that we are much less familiar with, that we also have to build into the contracts the ability to be flexible with the resources. So I'll just give you one example. I asked a couple weeks ago as a report came to the full board to say, I want to make sure we can take some of the remaining money that's not being spent and redirect it, because we are in a crisis right now, and I don't think it's okay to leave money that's not really being drawn down while we have individuals who are literally in crisis, and we can help. I think in the future we have to be able to have the kind of discussions with folks where we agree that there needs to be some flexibility in that partnership built in, so that, again, it's not a harm or a foul thing, because I recognize that some of what they're saying is, not some of it, all of it, people are afraid, and what we thought we were going to be able to do with these resources, we can't. If that's the case, then the board needs to be back engaged, because we made a policy decision or recommendation, decision to fund X, Y, and Z, and our nonprofits are saying we can't do that work. Then I think we have to come back and say to the board, all right, well then let's have a conversation. From your perspective, here are the things we want to recommend that we do. So anyway, I think that flexibility, because I think the stronger our partnership, the more intellectually honest we can be about how we proceed. And then finally, and this is the thing that I feel the most strongly about of all three of these things that I just want you to be aware of, the reason I've been really interested in understanding how many people we're helping through the process is because our nonprofit partners made the point that people were stuck in the process because we were not resourcing them to do this very specific activity. And to me, what that means is that if we're not making the mark, and they're right that there are all these people in need, then we're not doing something properly. I don't mean that they're doing something wrong or bad, or we're doing something wrong or bad, but it's time to course correct so that we can push as many people through these processes as we can with whatever window of opportunity we have. And if we don't, if our current partners don't have the skill set or whatever the challenges are, I want to understand what their needs are, because if we need to help them with in other ways to be successful, I want to know what that is. The problem with the way we're getting reports back now is all I see is people aren't hitting the marks that A, they told us they could, B, that we signed them up for, and C, that we told the public, right, the very frightened public, by the way, that we were going to be there to help them. So none of that, I think because these partnerships aren't new, so we're overlaying a new structure to a very old relationship, number one, so thank you for that. But we're also investing much more money than we ever did before. So based on that, to me, that's saying we have confidence in you, but we're going to have to do this a different way. So my question, that's a long way of getting to, and I want to thank Supervisor Simitian for indulging me in this, it's a long way of getting to where I think we need to be, which is, are we having conversations with our partners to ask them where we're stuck because we're not able to draw down money, and then therefore, if we can't do X, what's the why we should be doing? And if we can't do X, what's the support they need? And do you know the answer to those questions, or are you in the process of having those conversations?
We are actually in the process of having those conversations.
Okay.
Because of that very reason, that we're at a point within the contract cycle to where, it's checking in with those organizations to specifically survey that very question. So we are in the middle of that at the moment.
So I am interested in knowing, in addition to making the change that I requested a couple weeks ago as fast as we can, which with whatever partner organization we can, because I want to make sure we don't have people in crisis, especially medical crisis, that we can be supporting. Then I want to know as quickly as you can give it to us, even if it's off agenda, what the course corrections are that you're going to be making, and or recommendations that we want to make. And let me just remind you that I both know that we need to strengthen our relationships, strengthen our nonprofit partners, but the bottom line is, it's really about who we can or can't help. And if we're in a position where we don't think we can help, then we got to, and we have limits, then we got to rethink our strategy. We just need to do it fast. And I feel a real sense of urgency, and I'm a little bit nervous that that urgency isn't shared. And not because I don't think people are panicked, I think they are, but by urgency I mean, if this isn't working, let's go to here. So maybe I mean urgency coupled with agility. And if that's not the case, then I want to be dissuaded of that, and I'm good with that. But if that is the case, how do we help them, and what are we recommending the course correction is?
Okay. Yeah, we will most certainly come back with that information once we've had an opportunity. We'll make sure that we bring it back as soon as possible.
What's the timeline of these conversations you're having, Maria?
So we are most likely in the next, I would say, 2 weeks or so, we will have met with all the various groups. As because there are various areas and buckets of funding and services, we are arranging meetings with each of them. So most likely completely about 2 to 3 weeks. This is based on their availability to come to meetings, et cetera.
Well, again, I would just say, have you started those conversations already?
Yes.
Okay, so even if you've got just the tip of the iceberg, I wouldn't wait, because we're going to go right into budget. So I'm nervous that we're going to go into budget and the numbers don't look like where they need to be, and I'm having people give us feedback. Mm-hmm. By the way, people aren't complaining. I don't mean that people aren't angry. They want services, and they're scared, and I know that's adding a layer of tension to all this. So I just want to act fast, because I feel I feel nervous for people as well. And then Jeff Sessions was here in California scaring people even more, right? So I feel like so unproductive. I mean, I'm sure that's what he thinks about us as well, but all right. Well, thank you. Those are all my thoughts.
Thank you. The item before us is to simply receive the report. We've both offered some comments or thoughts. Can I get a motion to receive? Motion by Chavez, second by Simidian.
With an off-agenda report coming within the next, I would ask for the report in the next 3 weeks, just to give us what you've got as soon as you have it,
Yes,
even if it's not all done. Thank you.
And with that direction incorporated into the motion, and with the consent of the seconder, that would be me. And seeing and hearing no objection, unanimously approved. Thank you all very much. Thank you. That takes us to our last item on today's regular agenda, and that's item 15. And we thank you all for your patience on this one. And here again, let me just indicate we have two things going on here, Supervisor Chavez. One I will describe as substantive, which is to receive the report, and mindful of the suggestion that you made some time ago and which I supported, which is to try and be more forward-looking than retrospective in how we deal with these issues. And then the other piece of this conversation, which I don't think we need to spend much, if any, time on, is if you see the A, B, C, D, E, E, F, and ask what's going on, it's really about sort of reordering the reporting functions so that people are not chasing their tails quite so much as they have in the past. And I think we've got a slightly more orderly process, and one that keeps everybody in touch with everybody they need to be, but not quite as taxing on the team. So could we ask you all to introduce yourselves? And all of those microphones do work if you can figure out which button to push. And let's start with our director for the Office of Sustainability.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, President Simidian, Supervisor Chavez, members of the committee. I'm really happy to be here today. My name's Susan Gilbert Miller, Dr. Susan Gilbert Miller, and I'm the director of the Office of Sustainability. To my left, I have Brad Angel, who's also from my office, and he's a management analyst. Also to his left is Ms. Susanna Mercado, who's from Facilities and Fleet. And finally, we have Mr. Kevin Armstrong, who is the interim sustainability manager within the Office of Sustainability. We have before you today two documents, and those are the Sustainability Master Plan Framework. In addition to that is the semi-annual Sustainability and Climate Action Report, which runs from October of 2017 to February of 2018, semi-annual report. For the semi-annual report, the first part of that is a Facilities and Fleet report that looks at the internal processes within the county in terms of the goals, objectives, and the status of different programs to achieve the sustainability and climate action goals. And the second part of that report is from the Office of Sustainability, looking at more of the community partnerships and programs also to achieve goals, objectives, and policies. So with your agreement, I thought I would talk first about the Sustainability Master Plan briefly, or I could answer questions if you prefer.
Supervisor Chavez, what's your pleasure today?
I have just a few questions because I had a chance to read it, and welcome. We're excited you're
Thank
here.
you.
Go right ahead.
Oh, thank you. So first of all, I have to say that there are a lot of people long before I was on the board who are really excited about sustainability and having a sustainability plan. I'm really also excited to see FAF still at the table because I think that's such an incredibly important partnership. And I see Sylvia in back just making sure it's all working. So that's very good. What I would like to recommend or request is that there be a way to give the board progress reports prior to the implementation of the full plan. And the reason is, I think, one, the board's really interested and excited about what you're doing. I think, two, you have a lot of board members who, or not a lot, I would say of the board, I've heard all of my colleagues at one time or another sort of weigh in on this plan. Actually, I really can't think of anybody who hasn't. And I think it will help everybody understand what to expect when plan implementation comes. And so I don't know if that's in every other month and it can be off agenda, but I think it's really important that it be shared with the whole board because you have a lot of interest from the entire board.
Dr. Gilbert Miller, before you respond, because how long have you been with us now?
Since October 30th.
Okay. So I know you know that we have a process of off-agenda reports where we basically say, we'd like to know something about something. Would you please just send us a report? It comes to us all. At the suggestion of a member of the public, actually, we now have a sort of a central repository for that, and it's a public document. But that's a somewhat less burdensome way of making sure that all of us are kept in the loop about what's going on in a timely fashion than asking you to be here every month and sit for 3 hours while you get to be item number 15. So I think that's where you're headed. Yes, Supervisor Chavez is with that. So is that something that sounds manageable for you and your team?
Absolutely. I think that's very manageable.
That'd be great.
Good.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? I have nothing else today. I appreciate the report. I found it very readable, which is not always the case with reports of this sort. So I know that I'm supposed to plan, do, check, and act, and I know what my 4 C's are, and I feel like I'm ready to go. And I do think, going back to the recommendation that Supervisor Chavez made previously about the reporting process, anything we can do to put this committee and the other committee that you report to and the board in a position to be sort of thinking about where we headed rather than simply learning about where we've been would be helpful to us in our work. Okay?
Yes, that would be fine. I did want to point out that there was a recommendation also about consolidating the reporting. So I think what the recommendation at this point would really be that we would provide reports on the status monthly, on the status of what's happening with this whole process of doing this management system, and do that during the planning phases as well as once we get into the implementation phase.
I can ask you pause for just a minute because I'm going to go to my staff and ask Mrs. Zanardi to join us down here at the front, which I haven't done to her before, so she can be a little startled. But she has played a role in our office in trying to bring some order to the chaos that is your reporting process.
She has indeed.
And I want to just, rather than wing it here, I want to do it with her engagement. Is there a microphone there that'll work for you, Ms. Zanardi? Thank you. All right, go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. So what the recommendation would be that I would be doing these off-agenda, I guess that's what they're called, yes, off-agenda? Yes, off-agenda reports about the status of how the sustainability management framework is all rolling out and the progress that we're making on that. I was under the impression that the committees would still be interested in having periodic updates in terms of what was going on against the environmental stewardship goals and also against the status of various programs to implement those goals and to make progress on those goals. So for that, the recommendation would be that we would, within the Office of Sustainability and with the assistance of FAF and other departments, have a consolidated report. Right now we're doing a report for your committee, FGOC, that's looking more at the status of programs, and to Hewlett, there's a report that's looking more at progress on the environmental stewardship goals. And the recommendation would be that there would be one report that is dealing both with progress on the goals and then the programs that are being implemented in order to advance progress on those goals, and that we could report on that. My recommendation was that we would report on those twice a year, semi-annually. But my understanding is that perhaps there might be interest in having those reported on just a little bit more frequently.
Let me turn to Ms. Zanardi, Chris Zanardi from my office. Ms. Zanardi, how does that square with items B, C, D, and E in the agenda today, which were designed to bring a little more order to this reporting process?
What Dr. Gilbert Miller is describing is what is proposed. And I think what she's trying to do is thread what's proposed with what Supervisor Chavez was perhaps suggesting to marry the...
Got it. May I make a recommendation?
Please.
Since it sounds like you worked on this framework already together.
The reporting piece.
Yeah, no, I got it. I just meant that piece. Really, let me just tell you what I was looking for, and then you can tell us the best way to do it. I'm fine with that. What I wanted to make sure of is that until we were at full implementation, I wanted to make sure there was a way to track how the different departments were responding, how far along we were getting, what the challenges were, so we weren't waiting too long before we were able, because we meet with all these folks all the time, and if we can be helpful or annoying, whatever it takes, I wanted to better understand that. So if there's a better way to communicate that to the board and keep people updated, I'm fine with that. But what I was really trying to do was get what's happening in the interim so that we were encouraging. Because frankly, what's exciting about this is you're really looking at a real county-wide response. When we had before you, when you all were a twinkle in our eyes, when we were having these discussions, one of the challenges was the departments were really all over the map, and there were really different levels of interest, and there still are really different levels of interest all over the map, and people with different levels of skill sets in each of those departments. So that's really what I was trying to be able to make sure that the board could provide support on. So you can tell us the best way to do that.
And Dr. Gilbert Miller, I thought, and if I was wrong, just feel free to say you were wrong, Supervisor, but I thought what you were saying is that you can do B, C, D, and E that are in the, on the cover, the very first page of the report that you have given us, or the referral documents you've given us at packet page 308, and that there's nothing inconsistent in that with providing the kind of off-agenda report that Supervisor Chavez has requested.
I think that's correct. I think we can do B, C, D, and E, and in addition to that, add a status report on a monthly basis in terms of how this process is all rolling out. Would that meet your needs?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great.
Because that still gets us to a consolidated report. I would still, of course, want to ask for Hewlett to also agree to this as well, because this involves their report as well.
Good point.
Fair enough. So I'm going to ask Supervisor Chavez if I can get a a motion to approve the recommended action with the further direction for a monthly off-agenda report.
So moved.
A motion by Supervisor Chavez and a second by Supervisor Simidian. I don't believe we have any other cards on this item. And Dr. Gilbert Miller, I'm going to look to you and the three people that are at your sides to say last call. If that's a problem or if it needs revision, please let us know. If not,
I think they're actually quite delighted.
yes, no, that was our hope and expectation, was that the reporting process would be somewhat less burdensome and a little more rational, perhaps. So thank you for that. Without objection, unanimously approved, and that brings us to the end of item 15. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
More substantively, thank you for the work that's actually in the report. So,
Thank you.
all right. Supervisor Chavez, I believe that takes us to a motion to adjourn, and I will simply announce that without objection and seeing and hearing none, we stand adjourned. Thank you all very much for being with us
Thank
today.
you, Joe.